Thank you for accepting my invitation, first of all.
Of course.
I
I'm
was
intrigued.
I was very surprised that somebody took me seriously. I know I know with my 64 subscribers we don't look impressive, but we're curious.
I love that. Can you tell me a little bit about the podcast? How did you get it started? And what are you
Well,
trying to do?
I got familiar with podcasting in 2014, but I was in college at the time, and it it was weird. It was weird. I felt like, how did these guys figure this out, and the radios haven't figured it out yet? Because they seem to just do whatever they want online and seem to do a better job than you. But then over time, the more I got interested in it, the more I realized, maybe I want to start something around culture.
Hmm.
One of my favorite things to do is just get people from really different cultures together and just have them be themselves and just see if we can come to an understanding before we tear each other apart.
That's sweet. This is a sweet goal.
So just that, I mean, and also I kind of like learning languages. I like this format of learning, especially just conversations, get you curious, get you to research, you exchange these ideas. It's been the most efficient way of learning for me. So but I was still not motivated enough to start my own podcast. And then I think in May of 2020, when we were all confined and going crazy, I decided now, as crappy as it has to be, I need to talk to someone. Like I haven't had any significant human interaction in a while, and I haven't learned anything from the voice of somebody else except online. Like, this has to change. So I just started with my little phone in my bedroom with one of my friends, and I guess 60 something episodes later, here we are.
I love it. It seems like a very productive COVID project.
Thank God.
That's awesome.
and and how about yourself? Do you listen to podcasts on your free time?
I do.
Ah,
Although whenever they're video format, I don't tend to do it because I usually do it while I'm walking or something else. But
okay. And what are some of your favorite podcasts out there?
hmm, what's good? I think I listen to like the NPR standards. Death,
Mm,
Sex, and Money is good. Ear Hustle is good. Let's see. I should check. I'm opening my app to see what else is in there. Invisibilia is good. Let's see what else is in here. I've been recently liking No Stupid Questions,
mm.
which is Angela Duckworth, who wrote Grit, got really famous for talking about grit, and Stephen Dubner, who is the journalist part of the Freakonomics team. And they just ask each other interesting questions, and they're really smart, and they have thoughtful ideas, and they both seem like pretty interesting people.
Nice. I
So that's my
stumbled
favorite.
I stumbled upon that book a couple of years back, and that really got me interested in economics. But I mean, it seems a little intimidating from the outside. But the Freakonomics book,
Yeah.
basically,
How so?
yeah, I watched a video online, and it was explaining basically how sumo wrestlers cheat. So I thought, I need to read this. I really do. And I mean, all these stories, and wow, maybe I should have done economics.
What did you study instead?
Mechanical engineering.
Yep. I
Uh,
think that economics pulls a lot of people who studied physics or engineering and really kind of liked math and liked doing quantitative stuff and liked playing with data, playing with models, but then got more interested in the people side of things. And economics, I think, is a nice home for people who like math and like numbers, but want to apply it to something more interesting than how far a spring goes, or you know.
Yeah,
Those
because
kinds of
you articulated that very well, because I never thought about it that way, because that was my issue around my senior year of engineering. I thought to myself, first, I noticed how my ability to to communicate with regular people really got bad, really got bad. Like there's this kind of engineers. I guess every industry has its own dialect, and because engineers are so dialed in when they're doing their work, and the work is so fact-based, it's very hard to have these casual conversations when you're around people who've studied liberal arts and stuff like that. And as
yeah.
well as I thought about, how is it that I'm going to be a decent engineer if I'm building stuff for people that I do not understand?
Mm,
That
yeah.
that really dawned on me. Like I lost sleep over that question. And as I started getting interested in sociology, thinking it could help me understand. I mean, it helped me understand a certain side of things, but it still didn't grab my attention completely. And as well as trying having some entrepreneurial endeavors, I realized, oh, really what I do not understand is this whole economy thing. Like I really took it for granted. We only had 1 year of it in high school in our system. I went to high school in Gabon,
Mm-hmm.
and basically the way your last 3 years of high school are set is you're split from the general studies to science or literature. Then the
Mm-hmm.
second year after that, some of you get to go into languages on the literature side. Some get to go to the hard sciences, math, physics, biology. But then there's a middle group who really doesn't have any parents, and they
Mm-hmm.
just send them to the B series that studies mainly economics. But
Mm-hmm.
there's it's looked down upon in the culture.
Yeah.
So students, I don't feel like students take a deep interest to it until later when we finally realize, oh, you have to budget. All the when
Mm-hmm.
if I want to do business, all these things I have to understand how they mesh together, and you realize, oh wow, I have another 4 years of economics at least.
It's okay. I came to it late too, so I like the people who came to it late, because people are sort of bringing in some experience outside of economics, which means, I think it means you're probably better at doing economics research, but definitely better at thinking about economics if you've seen something outside of the actual econ classes.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, for me, the the beauty of learning after college has been just dabbling in all these other fields. Because at first it was, how do they relate to engineering?
Right.
Then it became, how do they relate to business? Because entrepreneurship. But now it's more of a, the older I'm getting, thinking about in a few years, maybe I'll start my own family. I'm thinking, okay, how does it relate to the city where I'm living? For example, right now I'm really interested in the economics of the city of Houston,
Mm-hmm.
just understanding how the city was planned.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I recently found out that Houston doesn't really have is the only city in America,
With
maybe
no
to
zoning.
have zoning or something.
Yeah.
I was like, oh wow. And then I got into the details. I found this really good YouTube channel on city planning,
Mm-hmm.
and got into the details on how they chose a different model that's a little less rigid.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. What are the out? I mean, I like really seeing these city experiments, and
Yeah.
and it's really it's one of the beautiful things about America for me, because in all the countries where I lived before, the sample sizes are so small that it's really difficult to get a good understanding of what's going on. Whereas with these big sample sizes, 8 million size cities, 5 million size cities, these dynamics happen so much, so frequently, that you get good numbers and see, oh, decision taken in 1965, good outcome today. Bad decision taken then, oh, we need to fix this. I really like that experience. I mean, economics, you guys should get better at marketing. Really.
Yes. I think one of the biggest, the biggest additions to economics marketing was those Freakonomics books. Because for a long time, I didn't want to go into economics because people thought that economics was about how to set interest rates and maybe how to run a business.
Yeah.
And that is just a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of what economists do. And in fact, how to run a business is actually in business schools. It's not usually econ anyway. Mm-hmm. And so then Freakonomics showed to a really broad set of people that actually these are some tools that can be used to think about a lot of really crazy stuff, like sumo wrestlers cheating. And even if you don't care at all about sumo wrestlers cheating, I think it gave people a sense that they could use these tools to study what they're interested in. And it doesn't have to be, monetary policy or these things that I still find really kind of hard to get excited about. Important, of course, but yeah, it's been pretty thrilling to get to see it and to see that it gets used for, I think, pretty interesting stuff.
Oh yeah, because I mean, I don't necessarily have the entire expertise, but with my little engineering experience, I think I've been thinking of this idea of having a supercomputer out there that can run models of countries on, somebody's probably working on it. We're pretty crazy people, I know it. But having these models that are looking at the future of these countries, whether it's the economy, using all the economic data to find these future outcomes. I think those are like super cool tools that this field of study can I don't know, it's probably out there. There's probably somebody on Wall Street with some keeping it super quiet.
That's true. In a certain world, if you have the right model that predicts what's happening in the future, you keep it secret so that you can use it for investment. But yeah. I definitely do think that there are people who are sort of using what's happening in different countries to try to predict what would happen in a country if some variable changes. Mm-hmm. If we change our policy in this way, if we nationalize this industry, if we privatize this industry, if we get a bunch of health aid, if we don't get any aid, all of these are sort of big questions that people are looking at. And people will compare, okay, let's look at the places that got aid and the places that didn't get aid, or the places that privatized, places that didn't privatize. But one thing that's tricky is that there aren't that many countries. And so we often can't say that precisely because it's not a big enough experiment. We need to have, other universes where there are other countries, or figure out other ways to try to answer those questions.
Yeah. Not good. Makes me think. So what got you interested? What did you want to really study at the beginning, and then how did you get into economics?
Mm-hmm. So I was really interested in international education policy. I spent a year going to high school in France. I grew up in the US, and then I spent a year going to high school in France, and I was fascinated by the differences. And then read some stuff about, schools in Japan, and thought that there are these massive differences in how things work. Mm-hmm. And maybe if you, I think I had the idea that if you learn about all of these different ways of doing things. You come up with the best one and then figure out how to just improve policy in whatever place that you care about. So I got interested in education policy broadly, and I started taking classes that were around education. And along the way, I took one class in international education policy, something like that. And there were a few papers on Kenya. And there was one Kenyan guy there. And he was very charismatic. And so his stories were always so interesting. And these papers on Kenya were just so much more interesting than any of the papers that were in the US or any of the other, high income countries, where the questions are like, should 4th and 5th graders be in the same class or should they be in different classes? And the papers from Kenya were like, should we build more secondary schools or should we improve the quality of the primary schools? It just seemed like much bigger questions.
Yeah.
So that got me interested in Africa. And so then I studied abroad in Uganda, and I was always interested in math. And so that was sort of how I ended up. I was interested in these questions of, how to design policies that are, the most beneficial to the people who need it the most. And economics was a way to do that, where I got to use more math. I think is part of how that started out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Because I can see I can see the move from policy to economics, because I've been thinking about policy a lot lately, but it just feels too much like getting into politics, and I have an alert. I'm extremely allergic to politics, extremely. But it's so important. But because I think one of the field of innovation that's the most underrated is policy making.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the level of change it can bring to a place when policymakers are knowledgeable and really courageous. Because that's I mean,
yeah,
I don't know if I'm the one who's looking from a childlike perspective, but I think there's so much that can be done that's positive in the world if certain people can sit down and have a rational conversation that goes beyond our simple everyday little wars about who's getting $2 more on oil and this and that. I mean, I understand it's important. I want to make my money too. Hey, do what you gotta do. But there's, I had an episode with my father recently, and we were talking about the future of Africa, and he was being positive, motivating me, and trying to help me see the great picture, the big picture. And I was saying, I'm very cynical when it comes to those things, because when we need the money, when we say we need the money for stuff such as poverty, wars and stuff, we can't find it. We can't convince nobody to have it. But when it almost looked like the end of the world, I mean, at least over in the US, we printed 35% more money than we ever printed in history. I'm like, oh, so we can do that. I didn't know. I thought the Lord had to come back to help us do that. So to me, it's just policymakers should, I don't know, is there in policy making, I don't know if you can help me with this, but in policy making, are there people who are there as overseers of the policymakers, such as, hey, play the game as it's supposed to be played. Stop being crazy.
Yeah.
Such as that.
I mean, the political economy models say that's what voters are supposed to be doing, that we're supposed to vote somebody out of office if they're not playing the game appropriately, if they're just trying to get a little bit more of a chunk and trying not to pass policies that are good because they want to make the other team look bad or something like that. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who aren't going to switch parties. They're not going to vote for somebody who's so radically different from their beliefs just because the person on their side is not doing things quite as they should be doing. And so I agree with you. I think that there probably aren't incentives in place for policymakers to just focus on trying to make the best policy. I used to think, oh, they just don't know. I still think that sometimes this is true. I do think that there are cases in which the policymaker doesn't know and somebody can tell them, or the research can be done and that can be presented. But I do think that there are a lot of instances where that policymaker knows exactly which policy is beneficial and isn't going to do it because it's going to make the other guy look bad or look good. And so they want to make their team look good. And that is, I don't know, that seems very sad to me.
How do you cope with that, being in those spaces? I mean, if you have to interact with a policymaker or a decision maker in almost any organization, and you've given them the proper recommendation based on years of research, how do you cope with them still? Because I mean, there's a lot of smart people. I don't understand how they keep living with people continuously making the wrong choices just for short-term gains. How do you cope with it?
This is probably not the best answer, but I think in some sense I've steered myself away from politically controversial topics. And so I know that there are a lot of people who work on, in the US, for example, work on minimum wage policy, work on national health insurance policy, work on these things that are very, very fraught, where there are sort of two political sides, people have an allegiance, and they're going to fight for whatever is in favor of their side. Mm-hmm. And I don't tend to work on those questions because it seems super frustrating. I think that there are a lot of instances in which, there's some element of that. We know that this would be beneficial. One that I've been thinking about a lot recently is there should be some form of tying minimum wage to inflation so that we don't have to have this debate every 10 or 20 or however many years to suddenly jump the federal minimum wage up a big chunk. Mm-hmm. But nobody wants to do that because it's going to make the other side look good again. So I've sort of steered away from those kinds of questions, and there are a lot of questions that are less politically contentious. It's hard to get anybody's attention on those questions sometimes. And I think foreign aid is a big one like that there's no side that's necessarily saying we should have a lot more foreign aid and one side that's saying we should have a lot less, or what it is. I think a lot of politicians and voters don't really have strong preferences about it. Mm-hmm. And so, working in issues, sort of questions related to that ends up being a little bit less politically loaded. But there is, I do think even with that, so you brought up this question of like, the money can be found for anti-poverty programs, et cetera, but it's not. I think one big issue is that a lot of voters think that the US spends a huge amount on foreign aid. And we spend like nothing on foreign aid. We spend very, very little on foreign aid, and most of it is politically motivated. Like it's going to places that are not actually the poorest, but they're sort of strategic US interests. And if people knew how little the US government was spending, there'd probably be a lot more people who would say, oh wait, maybe we should, it's really inexpensive to send a bit for this specific, need. But because people have the wrong impression, I think, about what's happening. I saw some estimate that people think like 20% of US GDP is going to foreign aid, and it's less than 1%, much less than 1%. It gives people sort of a skewed perspective of what should be done.
How is it possible that people have such a wrong perception of something that's probably easy to figure out? I mean, the era of social media, I guess, but that because I mean, I'm until I guess 2 seconds ago, I thought the same thing. Because I mean, I've never, I don't find the subjects interesting enough.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I think that's what it is for a lot of people. Is I don't really care. It's not part of my day-to-day life. I'm not that excited about it. If somebody does care, I heard about an earthquake, I heard about a famine, I'm gonna send $20 through whatever organization initially comes and says, do you want to save a child or something silly? They'll do that, and there's not a lot of thought about this being sort of a US political vote related question.
Why should people really take the time to consider foreign aid? Why should an American citizen take the time to take the subject seriously?
Tough question. I'm not even sure that I think that everybody should. I think that everybody has a lot of stuff on their own plate, and I respect that different people care about different questions in the world. And I tend to think that people who care about somebody other than themselves, that's a great thing. And especially if you care about somebody who has fewer opportunities than you do, that's a great thing. And so in some sense, foreign aid is one version of that, thinking about, how the US should relate to lower income countries. I think that's one good way to do it. But I think there are plenty of sort of other very important US policy questions that people can focus on that are also probably good to have more attention on.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. But as for, my personal position on the question is, I get to enjoy the ability to think from those multiple perspectives because of the cultural experience. And the foreign aid, what would you say has been its benefits over the past 50 years for developing countries, for example?
I think that this is a big open question, and it's one, maybe this is how I deal with these politically sensitive questions, is I tend to say I genuinely feel very strongly on both sides of this. I think that there are really compelling arguments that that foreign aid is really dangerous.
Yeah.
That it's, and I think we know that some forms of foreign aid are undermining what's happening. An outside power coming in and saying, we're going to fund whatever it is that they want to fund, and we're going to ignore the government. That really means that the government then is less responsive to people. The citizens have less respect for the government. It's not sort of building long-term state capacity. That said, if there's a big need and the government is saying, hey, Ebola just hit, we don't have the funds to figure this out and to make sure that this goes away and doesn't spread to the countries near us, then I think that there is a moral imperative for countries that can afford to do so to sort of jump in and help as possible. Yeah. But it's tricky.
Very tricky, very, very tricky. I've had the chance to listen to a few people, especially activists in Africa, those who really, they all belong on a certain spectrum.
Sure.
Let's just put it that way. And I'm very divided on those questions, because one of the enriching things in my life has been the fact that I've had all these people from different cultures kind of bless me with either their time, experience, resources, and it's pushed me a little further than I would have been if I did the whole thing on my own. So I understand where a need for a world where we help our neighbors is important, but also how much is the help actually stopping the neighbor from developing their own abilities?
Right.
I was studying a book a few years back about systems, and it's a property of system that if the system is assisted for too long, then it starts depending on the assistance, and it can't live without it. It kind of develops this parasitic symbiosis, that's really dangerous for both. So I mean, those questions are, I mean, oof. Thank God I'm not the one who is paid to think about these things.
But I think one thing that's nice is that I do think the question of like foreign aid, good or bad, is pretty interesting and pretty difficult. But there are often sort of smaller questions, which is, let's assume there's an international organization that's set up to fight malaria or to fight HIV or to fight COVID. How should that organization function? So how should that organization function? One, like we were talking about before, in terms of to not undermine state capacity in the places where it's working, but also to actually fight whatever it is, whatever disease it's trying to fight. Yeah. And so those questions, I think, end up being a little bit less controversial. Well, sometimes, often being a little bit less contentious, and still really important, right? So foreign aid's probably not going to disappear. Maybe it could be expanded in a big way, or at least targeted in a way that would be sort of more focused on poverty alleviation and these kinds of things. But there are ongoing questions of how should this organization run whatever program it is that they're running.
Oof.
Those end up being fun.
Questions. That brings me another question. That brings another question to mind. What's the most difficult question in economics that you've worked on so far?
There are a lot of difficult questions. Probably the most difficult ones are the ones that I decided not to work on because I had no good way of answering the questions, but that I have tried to work on. I think I've been really interested recently in the question of how probably a government, but really any organization fills positions in different geographic locations. So a lot of countries have a huge variety of places to live and what it's like to live in those places. And one thing that a lot of countries, rich countries and poor countries, face is difficulty in getting service providers to more remote locations. What we mean by remote is sometimes not well defined, but often places where the weather is pretty harsh, where access by road to anything is limited, access by road to capital cities is pretty limited, maybe access to stores and places to purchase things. In the US, people often think about this as just access to good restaurants is limited. So how do you get somebody to move to places where you still have kids, you still want to provide schools, you still have people, so you still want to provide health centers? How do you get doctors and nurses and teachers to live in those places? And different countries do it in such interesting and different ways. And how can you do that in such a way that people don't leave? People don't, I'm a teacher, you've sent me to the most remote place, I'm not going to be a teacher anymore. If this is the only place that you're going to let me be a teacher, I'm going to go and do something else. I'll go to a private school or and I think that that's been a pretty interesting question. So I've been thinking about this a lot in Kenya. I think that this is a big issue in a lot of Kenyan public service, but there's one program that recruits and trains Kenyan university graduates to go all over the country to work as sort of literacy aides in low performing public primary schools as designated by the county. And the government set this up initially out of desire to have people interact across groups. So there was recognition that there exists some ethnic tensions in Kenya. Some groups don't want to talk to anybody else, but maybe they haven't met enough people of that group. And so what if we encourage some of this interaction and in really positive ways? You've got this like cool 22-year-old who goes into the small town and plays with the kids and everybody's happy and it's very loving and friendly. And so it builds these, positive feelings. So how do you get that to happen when somebody kind of has a preference for living closer to home or living closer to a capital city? And so we've been thinking a lot about how to set those up, how to take into consideration people's preferences. Because sometimes when you think about what remote means, you could be on the beach or you could be on the mountains. And some people, the beach is just terrible, it's too sunny and the bugs are awful. And for other people, the mountain is just too I don't know, too desolate and too remote. And so if you just ask people which of the remote places you prefer, it seems like you can probably get people to stay in their remote position for a little bit longer. But anyway, yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it's actually very, very interesting to me, because as you were talking, I was thinking about my father is from a generation of teachers that moved from West Africa to come and teach in Gabon and other Central African countries. So you'll find a lot of their generation were basically, by government mandate, a lot of them were turned into teachers because the country wanted to provide national teachers to teach the population. So there was they produced a little too many.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the surplus went to different countries around Africa. So you'll find a lot of Togolese teachers in around African high schools and universities. A lot of those people were sent to remote areas. And my father, for example, I mean, I grew up in the middle of the equatorial forest in a city called Okonja, right? It's small city. Everywhere you look, it's just the forest.
Yeah.
And I mean, super cool place. Best experience in my life, no joke. But and when you were explaining your project, I thought that group of people had to move from really small cities. I mean, from small cities to small cities in the backcountry, cities that some didn't have power, some didn't have running water. And I wonder if interviewing that type of people who've had 30, 40 years of teaching experience might be a good data to have. But yeah, it's a.
So your dad was sent to one place. Did he have any choice about where he was going?
Family anecdotes. He had the opportunity between coming to Canada or going to Gabon, but because of personal consideration, it was better, I guess, to stay closer to family or something like that.
Okay.
And I think I was a newborn at the time, so I guess I messed up the plan. But yeah, he chose to go there, and I think after a few months, we the whole family moved there with him. And I mean, after that city, he moved to. He was told to move to another small city. And then after that one, we moved to the capital city where he finished his career. And through that experience, I met other foreign teachers who were in those cities with us, who were moved from small cities to small cities with their families. So it's more than 100 people. It's more than 100 people. And if you consider the other countries where this might have happened, there might be a good sample group to interview, just because from my perspective, there's an economic side of things. There's in some of those cities, housing was provided. There were entire gated communities were built to accommodate those families. A lot of those families started. My father, for example, with a couple of other teachers, started a small prayer group that turned into one of the first churches in that area. So there's some dynamics, definitely, that you could learn from. I mean, from my very, very experienced perspective.
No, this is exactly what I'm finding fascinating. So Botswana has a program where I think teachers are transferred every 5-ish years. And Kenya just started a program called delocalization that's specifically trying to move people around for a couple reasons, partly to like have people interact across groups, and also partly out of a fear of, if you stay too long in one place, teachers can be really powerful in tests and whether somebody gets to continue on to university. And so you could have more corruption if somebody stays in one place for too long. And so then the solution has been to move all these head teachers who have often been based in one place for 20, 30 years, have families there, to suddenly move them to someplace else that has a high need for teachers. So you're serving this other place, and that's great. I mean, in some sense, like, it's really great because of the provision of services to places that might not otherwise have somebody, but it's very disruptive potentially to the families who are doing that, or to the person who's doing it, especially, you know, if you've got a couple where both people are working, one gets transferred away and one's stuck behind, it's unclear how this is going to work. Yeah. But I'm fascinated to watch how many places have had this experience already of moving people, sort of forced, I don't know, forces, yeah, but pushing people to move to different places. Yeah. Where you know, yes, you don't have to do this, but if you don't, you're going to need a completely new career. Yeah. It's a pretty big incentive to continue doing that. Mm-hmm. But I think it's an interesting question of then how it changes the experience. I'm fascinated to see if we can some way to follow the kids who are moved along with this. So how does it change the experience of the rest of the family being moved and then interacting with people in all these different places? I think in some sense, in terms of, you know, building pro-social beliefs and building bridges across different groups that might otherwise be in conflict, is probably great. But in terms of establishing a life and doing what that person who's being moved wants to do, it's not always great. And so it could be a disincentive for people to even go into teaching if they know, if I go into this field, I'm going to have no control over where I move, right?
Yeah. I mean, like...
Or for some people, it'll be an incentive. This will be such an exciting career where I get to move all over the place.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of us, the kids of those experiences. I mean, we are a club. We know one another.
Yeah.
And we are these weird people who, I don't say don't belong nowhere, but we're the outsiders most of the time, even when we go back to our countries of origin.
Yeah.
Because we're not as familiar with the culture, but in the countries where we grow up, even when we assimilate as best as we possibly can, because most of us grew up in those countries, there's still that you're not completely from here when, you know, the real things in life happen. So, I mean, but at the same time, you have such a bigger network of acquaintances.
Right.
You have such a bigger experience. Most of us speak more languages than all our friends.
Right.
And our cultural depth is frightening at times. I know these people who speak 8 languages, their grandparents are from four separate places. I mean, it's weird, and they don't realize how much different they are than others. Now we don't, and what I noticed is that we are not as fanatical as most people. We don't get attached to teams. We don't get attached to
You're not a Rockets fan?
Even for Houstonians, born Houstonians, I don't recommend that for your health. Your doctor will agree.
It's a stressful time.
Stressful. I tried. Yeah.
Do you think you'll stay in Houston?
I like it here. I really like it here. I moved here even though it wasn't the smart thing to do at the time. It's better. The water, the sea air, the air from the sea just blowing over the city. It makes my spirit feel better. It makes me think more positive things. No, yeah, I like the city. I really like it. The diversity was surprising. I mean, people should really rethink their opinion of Texas, first of all, and then their opinion of
Houston. Speaking of needs some marketing, I think Houston needs some better marketing.
Yes. Pay me a couple of dollars and I will do the job.
Yeah. But our reputation is not as good as we are. I said I've adopted this as my home now.
Hey, yeah. Where were you originally? Actually, where are you from originally?
I grew up in upstate New York.
Ah, a New
Yeah.
Yorker.
It's a small town. It was a lovely place.
We're lucky. We're lucky you came to Texas. Now you're a better citizen of the world.
Now I get to escape winter, which is the wonderful thing.
Yeah. And New Yorkers are just such a different type of American to me. Like every time I meet a New Yorker, it's a different, not every time actually, but anybody that is visiting from New York that who doesn't live here, they have a certain intensity. Like I don't understand. We're not under that much pressure down here. People kind of still say hi in Texas. New Yorkers are ready to start a fight in traffic. I don't get it.
Crowded streets or something.
What's the difference for you between both cities?
Well, I grew up in a little town that was 4 hours outside of New York City. So it was a town of 8 to 15,000 people, depending. There was a college, 2 colleges. So it depends whether you count those colleges. So without the colleges, it's about 8,000 people. And so it was a much smaller place. It was not, not as hustle and bustly. Lovely little place to grow up. But yeah, I think in many ways that I think that the differences between any place I've lived and any other place are so much smaller than they seem before you live in the place. People are people, and it's true. There are these sort of smaller cultural differences about whether people say hi on the streets that when you first get to a place feel massive. Whether people smile on the streets, how long people will sort of engage with strangers, these kinds of things. But I think once you've been in a place for a long time, then that stuff sort of melts away a little bit. But
True. I know some very African New Yorkers. I know a bunch of them. and it was one of the things that I really like about cultures meeting, especially meeting in one person, is I saw this man from Cameroon dressed as a cowboy in the middle of Longview, Texas. And he was bringing his, I went to Laterno University, and there's they welcome this swimming club, and his daughter was in the swimming club, and he looked more Texan than everybody in the zip code at that time. I mean, I thought to myself, I will never see this anywhere else in the world. This is what I love. He's out of place in all the right ways.
Yes. I like that. Out of place in all the right ways. I think that there's a lot of that here that's really pretty wonderful.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I really enjoy the city. I can talk to people from 20 countries in one day if I want. It's off. Whereas, and I mean, what to you makes Houston different from other Texas cities?
I've never lived in any other Texas cities, but
What?
I know.
No, stop. U of H shouldn't be taking all your time. Okay, branch out a little bit. Visited, but not lived in. For research purposes.
Yeah. Where should I live? Where would you recommend?
Houston still. Okay, Houston still.
But to try.
Austin, I would say. Austin is my second best choice. Dallas is not bad for serious people, but I like a little bit of chaos with my city. Mm-hmm. So Austin is the better part. Too many boring people make a boring city. That should be a law. That should be against the law.
It's okay. You can put everybody together if they want to be in the boring city. Special boring town, USA. Yeah. No, Austin seems delightful. I've visited a few times. I'm a vegetarian. Austin has a lot of great vegetarian restaurants. It's a big perk.
Yeah.
But Houston has great vegetarian food from all over the world, which is pretty nice too.
Yeah, definitely. Let me not waste your time. I was reading this paper again this morning just to be ready. And once again, the economic explanation of, by the way, did you notice the smooth transition?
Yeah, it was amazing. Well done. You got the podcast skills.
But yeah, I was reading the chapter on Rwanda that you wrote. First, what got you interested in writing this paper?
Yeah, I studied abroad in Uganda.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was there, the director of the program, Dan Lamonia, amazing man, he brought us, there were 17 of us, all mostly from the US. He brought us to Rwanda for a week. And as one does, beautiful country, really, really stunningly beautiful. And then while we were on this trip, we visited a preserved church. So there were a few churches where massacres had happened that had been sort of left as a marker so that people could come visit and see what had happened. And we went to this church, we're sort of wandering around, and they needed a French translator. So I spoke French. I'd lived in France for a year. And so I was translating, and I'd never really translated before. I spoke French and I spoke English, so it should be fine. But I was translating for this woman who was kind of the host of this church. And I didn't know how to translate. So I was trying to figure out, as I was translating, I was trying to figure out, when somebody says, I saw this, do I say, she saw this? Or do I say, I saw this, in her words? So as I'm trying to figure this out, it became clear that she was the host of this church because she had lost her whole family at the church. This is terrible, I can't remember the number, but I think she had 12 children who were all killed in the church during the genocide. And there was a man who had been sort of standing in the trees sort of as we were watching, and he had also lost all of his family members, his wife and all of their kids. And this was, this really speaks to how privileged my life had been, or has been. And this was the hardest thing I've ever done, was telling somebody else's story. And I was just so moved by it. And so, it kind of just got deep inside of me, and I couldn't stop thinking about it for years. And so then I think that's a big part of why after graduation, I moved to Kenya. I just sort of wanted to I kept trying to get jobs in Uganda and Rwanda, but there weren't as many jobs in Uganda and Rwanda. So I got this one job in Kenya that was right on the border with Uganda. So it was as close as I could be. Nice. But this stuff was just stuck in my head. And I think one of the things that was really striking about the genocide to me was the number of people who participated. So the number of people who killed is what often gets talked about. There's a lot of debate about exactly what that number is, but it's clearly a very, very high number. But it was hard to stop thinking about how many people had participated, and to think about how that decision works, and how so many people could be in a position to think that this is the thing to do. Just really struck me. And so I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I actually started thinking about conflict between traditionally herding groups and traditionally farming groups all over the place, all over the world. I spent a summer in Burkina Faso trying to get data on conflict and prices of the herding products and prices of the farming products. And then, unfortunately for that research project, but very fortunately for Burkina, it's an incredibly peaceful country, and there was effectively no conflict, so there was no research study to be done there. Yeah. But then while I was doing that, I heard about some data that was available in Rwanda, and decided that I could try to study the thing that had been interesting to me from the beginning, and try to sort of look into what was going on there. And it was the first big project that I did in graduate school, so I had a lot of time, and so I could kind of read. I was going to say read everything that had been written about it, but it's impossible to get there because so much has been written about the genocide. But read a lot that has been written, and it still sort of continues to be a fascination.
Yeah.
But
It's
yeah, trying to make sense of what had happened. And it's impossible to really make sense of it, but it was interesting to spend some time trying,
yeah.
thinking about it.
The as I was browsing and I stumbled on the abstract. It was the first time because I've watched documentaries trying to explain the origin of the conflict and the factors that were involved in the genocide, but it was the first time that it was explained from. I mean, I took interest in the economic explanation of it, and the abstract was very compelling. So luckily, I got the opportunity to read the paper, and there's a there's a lot of cause and effect things that were brought up in the paper that are really striking. For example, the how the power of radio is displayed in the I believe what the word used was in the efficiency
Hmm.
of the atrocities. Like, has media, is it the first time or is it something that's recurrent in history that media is used so powerfully?
Um, that I know of, it is the bloodiest use of media.
Yeah.
So I think that there are other instances that find, more exposure to media about something has changed a lot of activities that people have taken. So more exposure to Fox News encourages people to vote Republican in the US, more exposure to news about a famine because, for example, the Olympics aren't going on or it's a slow news day, encourages more foreign aid to go to that place. So, there are other instances where we see that sort of some kind of media is changing what people are doing, but this is definitely, I think, the starkest that I know about, the most, I guess, the costliest. One thing, though, with the radio that I think is encouraging, and I suspect it's in parts inspired by the power of the radio during the genocide, is there's a professor, Betsy Levy Pollack, who's a psychologist, and she has done a lot of work in a bunch of different places, but interestingly in Rwanda, using radio to do the opposite. Basically, can we use radio to broadcast messages of peace and ideas about interaction between groups that are really positive, that actually encourage, love between different potentially competing ethnic groups. And so I think it's a powerful force, but it is possible that it can be a powerful force used for good and not necessarily for, inspiring killing.
Because I mean, as I read that specific section, I kept drawing these weird parallels with what is happening currently with the Facebook whistleblower and the way negative content is more engaging.
Yeah.
And I mean, at the time, what was being put on those radios were the most negative possible content, and that first it's kind of hard to think of how impactful negative messaging can be compared to, I mean, it takes much longer for positive messaging to catch on, but the negative ones is just boop bop. Is it because is it a trigger or just a conditioning thing?
That's interesting. So the paper that I cite in this chapter about radio in Rwanda, it's hard to disentangle. So we see that radio, like the presence of radio, makes people more likely to participate. And I think one interpretation of that is the negative messages make people feel negative things and do negative things. But the explanation that the author of that paper gives is actually that it's a coordination question, that you have a bunch of people who already have these negative views and negative beliefs. And what the radio does is it says, let's not just sit and stew about this, but now is the time to act. And that was why it was so effective in this case. And so I wondered the same thing a little bit about the negative messaging on social media that people talk about, how much of it is actually causing people to have these negative views, and how much is you already have this view and we're going to sort of, because you have this negative view, we're going to play on that and probably build it up, but also maybe cause you to take more actions because of it, because you believe it suggests to you that more people share your negative views. It's probably beneficial for people to learn that more people around them are loving than for them to learn that more people around them are hating. I don't know if that's the right way of phrasing.
That works. That makes sense. That makes sense. And I looked at the first big idea that you explored in the chapter, which was the Malthusian crisis. A couple of years back, I had briefly read the book, but as soon as I found out that basically the Industrial Revolution kind of proved the thesis obsolete, I kind of gave up interest in it. But then reading the chapter, I decided to look into it once again and research it a little. And how does it relate to the situation in Rwanda? Because there's a bunch of other countries that kind of fit the profile of the theory.
Yeah, no, I think the going idea for a lot of conflict studies is that you need many different factors to be in place. And so I was teaching grad students the last few days about different papers on looking at relationship between economic conditions and conflict. And so there are a lot of famous papers that show when, at least in agriculturally dominated societies, when there's less rain, then we see worse crops. So people have much lower incomes, and then we see higher levels of violence. Okay, so we see more crime, more protests, and more civil wars. So this makes sense, but it only happens if you don't have, a state that's able to redistribute properly, or not properly, but fully. It only happens if you are really dependent on one product. It doesn't happen, there's huge variation in rainfall in a lot of countries and no instances of civil war in those places. And so you need all of these different factors to be in place. I think that the Malthusian explanation was so compelling for a lot of people in Rwanda, or about Rwanda, because Rwanda was really, really dense, and is really, really dense. There are just a ton of people in a very small space. That said, it's a super, super lush, productive place. So you can, the land can actually maintain quite a few people. You can grow a lot on a very, very small plot of land. And so in some sense, the evidence on this is mixed, but I think that there's a lot that suggests that that's really not a sufficient explanation for what's happening. You can look at places that are in the desert, and it's very sparse, very few people, which should be fine. But it's very sparse, and there are very few people because it's not hospitable to living. You can't grow anything, and it's not fun to be that hot. So, but yeah, so I think that explanation is at least insufficient to explain what's going on.
But isn't it? Because I mean, in my research, I tried to look at the population size. In 1994, I believe the population was about 5.1, 5.4, something like that million, and right now it's 12.5. And I'm thinking, what isn't? I mean, from at least the Malthusian hypothesis, isn't this another just?
Are we at risk?
Yeah.
So first, I think that the 5-point-something million, maybe that's post-genocide, when a lot of people are in refugee camps outside of the country, because pre-genocide, it was more like 8 million. Although, sometimes these numbers are not so reliable. But that said, you've gone from 8 million to something less than that, and now up to 12 million, which is even more. So I do think, population pressure is a real concern and probably leads to conflicts over resources, whether it leads to civil war or whether it leads to sort of fights among children over their parents' homesteads, I think is another question.
Yeah.
I think, Rwanda's had some interesting policies since the genocide to try to prevent more conflict. You're not allowed to mention ethnicity in any form. Surveys can never ask what somebody's ethnic group is to try to sort of blur the lines. And there's, pretty serious crackdown on hate speech, very, very broadly defined. I don't think we're at risk right now, but
it's strange. I mean, it's because I look at the country, and of most African countries right now, I like to joke with my friends that if I move back home at this moment, I would move to Rwanda, because it seems like they're trying to move forward the best, at least.
Yeah.
They seem to have learned something, and leadership seems to be competent. So, and the prospect of a prosperous Rwanda are real to me, at least from the indicators that we have.
Yeah.
But
it's an amazing country right now. So 2 examples of this. These are just anecdotes, but they really show, I think, how incredible Rwanda is right now. I was there, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 10 years ago now. I'm carrying a computer, I'm visibly foreign, and it was 10 p.m. And a middle-aged, very cautious mother said, "You could just walk home." And I walked home at 10 p.m. by myself through the capital city. And it was just assumed, like, of course this will be fine. I wouldn't walk home at 10 p.m. by myself here. Nope. Anywhere, really. In my hometown, it's a tiny little town. Everything's very peaceful. Nothing. I would not do it there, right? But Rwanda is just, I think there's a risk that this means that there's a lot of crackdown on any kind of minor crimes, but as a result, it's an incredibly safe place. The other thing is that I've also spent some time working on a lot of health economics questions. I spent time thinking about what happens when antiretroviral drugs become available and how does this change people's risk-taking with HIV, okay? So I spent a lot of time in East Africa trying to get data on the rollout of antiretroviral drugs so that I could map which places have access and which places don't have access, okay? So where do you need to go 50 kilometers, where do you only need to go 2 kilometers? So I got this data in Kenya, I got the data in Uganda, and I got the data in Rwanda, but I had to drop Rwanda from the study because everybody lived within 5 kilometers of a health facility offering antiretroviral drugs. And this was in 2009. There was no control group because everybody had access to amazing healthcare. It's amazing looking at the health systems, and there's still health economists who study what's happening in Rwanda. And for the most part, it's just phenomenal. It works so well. You have a ton of young people in government who are very, very excited to rebuild their country. You have a ton of motivation and a ton of support. And in a lot of ways, Rwanda is incredibly functional right now.
So
also, it's beautiful and the weather's great. So I would totally recommend this place.
Oh yeah, the postcards look amazing. I mean, I've been following 2 or 3 of their content creators, and it looks like a beautiful place to me. I mean,
it really is.
Recently they hired the ex-CEO, I think, of Credit Suisse to be the chief of the national bank or something, and he seems like he knows what he's doing. So I mean, they look competent right now, at least. Okay, please, my family still lives in Africa. Okay, this is not personal, but they seem more competent than most of the leaders on the continent. They seem to have an actual plan. There's a few countries like that, but none that actually is moving as fast and as well as Rwanda. and that's really impressive to me. I really am curious of the type of innovations that will come out of there, because it seems like it's something that is necessary for the future stability of the country, not just
Yeah.
developing agriculture, but true innovation.
Yeah.
But how, when, how, I'll need a crystal ball for that.
Yeah.
But yes. Okay.
But I do think there's, I mean, I think one of the reasons that you've got such a, you know, so many public services are so well run in Rwanda. And this is sort of a creepy reason, but everybody's new-ish to government, right? Like the government, well, I guess now it's 27, 26 years old. But that's still relatively new. You don't have people who have become bureaucrats and have gotten jaded with public service. It's really, you know, everybody's energetic and newish to their jobs and really motivated. And so in some ways, I think for a while, the government of Rwanda was functioning in the ways that startups function. Yeah. So it was kind of sleek and motivated and able to get a lot done. It also had, you know, getting back to the earlier conversation about foreign aid, it also had a ton of foreign aid pouring in, right? It was obviously like the most famous atrocity of the last, I don't know, 50 more years. And so there was a lot of interest in sending money. And so another kind of fun thing that Rwanda is able to do is to turn away aid that is not that helpful or undermining because they have so much access to it. So that's
Does that mean that the prospects for upward mobility in the country have truly changed?
It's a good question. I know that there's been a huge investment in secondary and tertiary education. For a long time, people left Rwanda to go to school outside of Rwanda, and now I think Rwanda attracts more people to come to school there. I think that this move from French to English that happened, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago, that kind of changes it. So I think if you speak English or you're able to learn languages pretty fast, then you're in a good spot. If you have grown up speaking French and you're struggling with learning a new language, then I think that could be a little bit tricky. But I do think that there are a lot of prospects for people to move up and to do sort of innovative things. And I'm hopeful. I'm cautiously pretty hopeful.
Yeah. Anyways, thank you so much for taking the time. I'll try to not take too much more of your time, but I hope we can definitely continue this conversation because there's so much more I'd like to learn, and so
this was delightful.
I have.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. You have a great day and a great weekend in 2 days almost. Yeah, it's almost the weekend.
Awesome.
All right. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you so
much.
Thanks.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.